This conference will now be recorded.
Hello and welcome to our session. My name is Marvin Boss, and I'm with the BAASS Business Solutions development team. On the development team, we get a lot of requests from customers to make things interactive and simple to use within Sage 300. With that in mind, we have developed a accounts receivable inquiry and collections tool, which we think will help you when you want to run your agings and contact your customers about overdue accounts. The standard Sage aging report in accounts receivable is a very complete and a very useful tool to use for collections. However, we've taken the report and we've gone a step further with it to make it an interactive environment for the user who's on the phone with a customer attempting to collect on invoices. So right from our Sage 300 desktop, I'm going to launch our custom accounts receivable inquiry screen. When the screen loads, it is a blank canvas, as you can see here. There are a couple of options which are set by default that you can change if you like. Looking at the top of the screen, we have an option for age by document date or age by due date. Age by document date is the default selection. The next selection is summary or detail, and summary is the option chosen by default. I'll explain the difference between those in a few minutes. Below these options, we have the blank grid, and this grid will populate with records when we hit refresh. When you hit the refresh button, the program reads your Sage 300 database, and in this case, I'm using the sample company limited sample data that ships with every Sage 300 installation. The program reads the database and performs a accounts receivable aging based on defined aging buckets. In this case, we have current, 31 to 60, 61 to 90, 91 to 120, and over 120 as our aging buckets. Those aging buckets are defined under the File menu on a Settings page here. So if you prefer, you could change how the documents are aged inside of the program. When we hit the refresh, it runs the aging, and when the grid is in summary configuration, it shows one row for each customer. And on that row, we have the customer code, customer name, the group account set, terms code, currency code, territory, and sales rep. And the sales rep is defined as the first sales rep defined for the customer, so sales rep 1. Then it shows the summary aging over here. So this gives you a one-row look at each customer with their total accounts receivable aging. Beside each customer row, there's a little plus sign. And when we click that plus sign, the grid drops, and underneath each customer is a listing of their open accounts receivable documents. I'm just going to make this column a little bit wider. So we have the document number, which would be the invoice number or credit note number, a reference, the customer purchase order number, document date, due date, last note, which I'll explain in a minute or two, the age, which is the age of the document based on the current Sage session date. And then on the right, we have the aging of the particular invoice. So that's the summary look at the grid. If we change this to detail and we hit refresh, the grid now changes so that instead of seeing one row for every single customer, there is now a row for every document. And whether you choose detail or summary, that's a matter of your own personal preference. The data presented is exactly the same, it's just in a slightly different format. So I'm going to go back to summary, and I'm going to hit refresh. So now we're back to our summary look at our accounts receivable grid. On the right, we have this selection for amounts in customer currency, which is the default selection. The other option is amounts in functional currency. And this is important if you are running multi-currency inside of your Sage 300. You'll notice in the currency column that the currency is based on the customer currency. So we have a mixture in this column of USD, CAD, GBP for pounds, Japanese yen, and so on. The agings are based on the currency of the customer in this case. So the highlighted one is JPN for Japanese yen, and that amount is 17,214 yen. By changing the amounts in customer currency to amounts in functional currency, we can see that it changes the currency column so that it now reflects the home currency of our Sage 300 system, in this case, CAD. It also changes the aging amounts to reflect the Canadian equivalent of the document's amounts. So in our case here, we had JPN for Japanese yen, and instead of 17,000, it's now $229.34. When we expand, the same holds true for the numbers on each individual document. So if we change it back from functional currency to customer currency, we can see that the numbers now change to reflect Japanese yen. I'm going to leave it in customer currency for the time being. Now, within the grid, we can do quite a lot of filtering and sorting in order to work with a subset of records and to quickly find information that you're after. In each column, there is a little drop list, as you can see here. When we hit the drop list, in this case, I have selected the rep column. We see this pop-up window with one entry for each of the reps that are in the grid. So if we were only interested in looking at reps BB, DA, and DN, I will select those three and hit OK, and now the grid changes to include reps BB, DA, and DN only. The other rows in the grid, they are hidden for the time being. Pressing this button beside the drop clears the filter and restores all the rows. So any column that you see with the drop list beside it can be filtered in that manner. You can also key in a value that you're after in the yellow filtering row at the top. So if we were looking for all companies with the word design in their name, we could type in the word design, and we see that the grid now has one record, breakaway designs. Again, we can press the clear filter to restore the grid back to all of its rows. I'm going to expand under customer 1200. And I'm going to select this particular record. You may have noticed in the bottom corner, we have a little documents area here. The program is designed so that you can associate a PDF document, one or more PDF documents, with any particular invoice. In this case, I have IN 61 selected, and there is a PDF file, in61.pdf, which has been associated to this invoice. By double-clicking on the file column in the documents area, it will launch your default PDF reader with that document loaded. And this is handy if you wanted to get a look at the actual printed invoice that's been sent to the customer. Associating these PDFs can be done inside of the program in a couple of ways. Under this menu option, which is PDF documents, we have an option for load PDF documents, which brings up a screen which allows you to process a specified folder on your workstation or on your network and associate PDF files found in that folder to specific invoices and customers in your Sage 300 system. I'm not going to go through that process now. Another way that you can have PDF documents generated and associated is by using an invoice PDF generator that's part of this application. When we select that option, this pop-up window appears and allows us to generate invoices for a given invoice date range, for a given customer range, and or an invoice number range. There's also an option here to generate open invoices only. So if we were to fill in these options and hit generate, the program will generate a PDF copy of the invoices and place them into special folders on your network. Under the settings, under the Invoice Generation tab, we have an option to generate either the order entry invoice, if you have order entry installed, or the accounts receivable invoice. In our case, we have the Use OE invoice selected, and the invoice template is OEINV01.rpt. And we can help get all of these settings set up so that they match whatever your current configuration is in your Sage 300. When you have an invoice selected, in this case we have IN0061 selected, you'll notice on the very bottom of the screen there is an area for notes. This line says Notes on Selected Invoice, and this is a special area where you can add and edit notes on a particular invoice. So if you were on the telephone to Mr. Ronald Black, who is our chosen customer, and you're discussing invoice 61, you can hit the little plus sign button here to add a new note, and it fills in a new line. The invoice number is already populated along with today's date and who is the user. So I'm just entering a new note, talk to Mr. Black, and payment was promised. Now when we move off of that invoice record, we notice that that row disappears because we're on a different invoice record. By selecting this invoice, we see that we have notes here. This also works in the detail. So here is our Mr. Ronald Black, customer 1200. And when we select in detail mode, this row, which is IN61, you'll notice that the note now appears. The last note column in our grid is a date of the very last note that was generated for that particular invoice. Also, we like to integrate with Sage 300 so that if you were interested in some more information about Invoice 61, you can double-click right on the document number, and that will invoke the Sage 300 Accounts Receivable Document Inquiry screen, which is the standard Sage 300 screen, and that will be loaded up with the document IN61 already in place. So now you can find out everything you want to find out about that particular document. Again, this is the standard Sage 300 document inquiry screen. Also, if we double click on the customer code, it will launch the standard Sage 300 customer maintenance screen, so that when you have Mr. Black on the telephone, then they may give you some new information, or they may have a change of address, or you may simply want to inquire more on their customer record. So double-clicking on their customer code will invoke the standard Sage 300 customer maintenance screen. So if you're on the telephone to Mr. Black, and I'm going to go back to summary. If you're on the telephone to Mr. Black and he asks you to send him an email with all of the outstanding invoices attached to it, we've made that pretty straightforward in this screen. Anywhere on the selected customer record, you can right-click and a menu comes up and you tell it to send email. This will pop up this screen with the customer, and as you can see here, a list of attachments that will be going out on the email. It's important to note that the very top attachment is a statement. The program will determine if there's ever been a statement generated for the customer and will automatically gather the last statement that was generated for the customer and include it on the email. Selectively, you can turn off any of the documents by clearing the Send checkbox here on the left. I've just entered my own email address in for the purposes of demonstration. When we hit Preview, you must have Outlook running. Currently, the application is integrated with your Outlook. It will generate an Outlook email message with an attachment for each of the documents that was specified to be attached. The body of the email is based on the Sage 300 email address setup, and you can tell it which message ID from the email messages you want to use by specifying so in our statements. So here it says, what email message ID do you want to use? And we've selected default. You can also tell it what statement template to use here for when you want to send along the statement. When you are on the customer row and you send an email, the program assumes that you want to send all open invoices associated to that customer in one single message. If you have a single invoice selected and you choose to send email, it will send an email to the customer. However, it will only have the one document selected. So there's a bit of a difference in how the email is generated based on if you have the customer row in summary mode selected or if you have an individual document selected. One final thing that I want to show you on the grid is the ability to group your grid contents. As an example, management may be interested in finding out what the receivables by sales rep are. If we take the rep column header that we have here and we drag it to this section at the top of the grid and release, you can see that the grid has now automatically grouped all the rows based on the rep column and accordingly has given an aging for each row. So this would be a total aging by rep. This grouping is available on any of the columns. I'll demonstrate with terms. So there was COD, due TBL, and N30. And each of those has their own aging totals. Okay, and one final piece that I want to show, up in the upper right, we have an Excel button. When we press the Excel button, the program will generate a workbook in the exact same format as the grid. And you can see here that because we are in summary mode, we have one row for customer. And in Excel, when we can now expand that to see the document detail below. This would be a handy tool if you wanted to run your aging and then take it offline. Perhaps email it to another user or email it to management. So that's a quick look at an accounts receivable tool that we've developed, which we hope will make it simple and flexible for you when you're on the phone dealing with your accounts receivable collections. Thanks for listening. Have a good day.